Thank you so much, Melanie. And good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm honored to be representing the Asian American Writers Workshop this evening, as Melanie said. It's been a real pleasure to partner with Melanie and her team at the Center for Fiction. I want to pass along my thanks for all of their work. And thanks as well to Eliana, Naya, and Sydney, who are off camera this evening, but making sure that everything runs completely smoothly without a hitch. If you're not already familiar with the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting, supporting, and developing contemporary Asian American and Asian diasporic fiction, nonfiction, poetry, translation, etc. We organize community arts programming in New York City and online, publish a literary magazine called The Margins, and much more. And we are online at aaww.org if you want to check it out. I want to be sure really quickly to thank our authors, Nawaaz, Jackson, Melissa, Tracey, and Soon for joining us this evening and sharing more about their work and their process. If you don't already know these writers, you are in for such a treat, and I'm really excited for you to encounter these books for the first time or to return to them in a new context. And yeah, again, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Melanie and team. I hope you enjoy the evening. I am going to turn things over to Nawaaz Ahmed, who will kick us off with a reading.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming here this evening. And thank you, Lily and Melanie, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm excited to be here reading amongst these really amazing books that I haven't heard of before, but I wish now to just listen. And therefore, I'm so glad to be going first so I can sit back and listen to them. I am the author of Radiant Fugitives, and this came out last year, and the paperback should be out, and I'm holding it in my hand actually, should be out in August. My novel follows two sisters, Muslim immigrants from India. The elder sister, Seema, was expelled from her family when she came out as a lesbian years ago, but since has moved to San Francisco, married a man, divorced him, and is having his child. The younger sister, Tahara, has also immigrated to the US and lives with her family in a devout Muslim community in Irvine, Texas. The dying mother is trying to get the sisters to reconcile and has arrived in San Francisco to help with the elder daughter's delivery, roping in her younger daughter's help as well. In the scene I'm about to read, Tahara is out shopping for dinner in San Francisco with Seema's friend Fiaz. She has just learned that their community mosque in Texas has been vandalized and that there was a fire in a children's Islamic school destroying the playground. The year is 2010, 2 years after President Obama was elected, and the nation is rocked with various protests, including against the development of mosques in the wake of the plan to build a mosque and community center close to the ground zero in Manhattan. So I'll read this section. Compared to the previous stores, the Safeway is large and brightly lit, aglow against the hills of San Francisco. They're back in the America Tahara knows. The bulb-ringed marquee perched atop a tall column like a torch overpowers the lusterless orange moon in the city-lit sky, though the moon is almost as full as it was the night before, only a tiny sliver missing. Glimmering shopping carts and shiny cars litter the busy parking lot. Inside, Tara is back among the label aisles and preoccupied customers pushing overloaded carts, familiar to her from every other chain store she's visited. This is America going about its business. Her earlier uneasiness floods back. She is small in this huge hall, hemmed in by strangers, mostly white, no Muslims, crowding the aisles. She is a black blot in her jilbab and hijab against the cheerful color of the rows of merchandise. Alert once again to glances cast her way, she suspects shoppers of avoiding her or plowing ahead ignoring her, as though to claim the space for themselves. She's ashamed of her earlier reaction to the men outside the halal market. It's not those harmless men, but decent people like the ones here she needs to beware. It's decent Americans like these behind the warnings and threats, the profanities and blasphemies. Go back to your savage lands with your bombs and your burqas, your Sharia and your polygamy. You're not wanted in America. She'd only read about it on the news and on blogs before, but now it's here at her doorstep. Her son Arshad's question echoes in her mind. Why do they hate us so much, Ammi? At times, she finds herself instinctively scuttling out of the way when a white shopper approaches. And then, in retaliation, she lingers over her selection to hamper an overeager shopper, taking her time to make her choice, determined not to be cowed. What were they thinking? If only they said it out aloud so she could challenge them. An image of the burning playground persists. She imagines her daughter Amina caught in the flames on her favorite swing, shouting to her mother to save her. The thought of being unable to reach her daughter in time sets her heart racing, her feet tripping in panic. The anonymous voices around her blend into an ominous soundtrack to the flickering flames. She wishes her husband Ismail were here. She needs his comforting presence. Seema's friend Fiaz's playful patter helps take her mind off of Irvine. He has a lively opinion about everything, including which brand of vegetable oil to use. She searches for the one he suggests, but when she turns around to place it in the cart he's pushing behind her, he isn't there anymore. For one long moment, she freezes. She's been abandoned here. Then, still clutching the bottle in her hand, she rushes to the end of the aisle, scanning the store for him. A relief. He's standing by an adjacent checkout counter. She's about to call out when she observes that he's conversing with two men, one white, one black, both in very tight V-neck t-shirts and indecently short shorts, their limbs and chests muscular, smooth and hairless. The three men are laughing and talking, completely at ease with each other. The clerk rings the men up and they collect their bags and take leave of Fiaz, who kisses them both on the lips. Tahara knows the men are a homosexual couple, one of the many San Francisco is notorious for. And the fleeting look, guilt, shame on Fiaz's face as he turns around and catches sight of her is enough to confirm another suspicion. Fiaz is gay too. It's obvious now. How could she have been so blind? How Seema and Fiaz must have laughed at her naivete, scorned her narrow-mindedness. A deep flush reddens Tahara's cheeks. Were you looking for me? Fiaz has regained his composure. He takes the oil from her and heads back to the cart. Do you know why the frying pan liked the oil? Because it was so refined. But now that she's wise to him, she is no longer susceptible to his banter. She maintains a studied silence for the rest of the trip. I'll stop here and I invite Jackson Bliss to read.
Nawaaz, thank you so much. That was great. I just want to thank Melanie and Lily for bringing this ensemble cast together. And I also just want to thank all of the writers for making this what is already a totally like bomb-ass like reading of Asian writers. It's an honor and a privilege to read with all of you. So I'm going to talk just briefly about Amnesia of June Bugs. This is a sort of post 9/11 New York novel. There's two basic motifs that I just want to talk about really quickly. The first is the novel goes backwards in time. It's essentially about 4 characters of color, 3 Asian American, 1 Moroccan French, and their lives intersect right before Hurricane Sandy hits New York City. And the second thing you need to know is the novel is sort of divided into the 4 stages of the life cycle of an insect, because of an ongoing motif of Asian bodies, Asian lives being sort of like insects. Often we're portrayed as small, often we're stepped on by white giants, but we are the sort of baseline of the entire food economy in the world, without which without the global South, the world dies, which is how I feel often about Asian communities, that we often get overlooked, erased, and yet without us, I think the world disappears. So those are the 2 sort of basic motifs running through the novel. And I'm just going to read a very, very short passage. This is told from the point of view of one of the 4 characters. His name is Winnie Yu, and he's a culture jammer. And for those of you that don't know what culture jamming is, it's basically political graffiti that uses advertisements against themselves to show the true cost of capitalism. So anyways, he's sort of wrestling with this and the fact that his ba just passed away. So this is a small portion from Ghostwriter of the Void. Earlier that day, Winnie had jet-setted to Greenpoint with Mbaz when he saw his neighbor, Mr. Lee, on the subway platform playing his gushin again. It was the first time Winnie had seen him since the teenage gangbang on 116th Street, since the day the old man had carried his punk ass to some brand new Chinese diner, since the day he told Winnie about the invisible dress and the Chinese girl who sang for him inside the Xinjiang re-education camp. The world was caving in now, man. Yo, Win, isn't that like your neighbor or something? Mbaz asked. Nah, Winnie said. Girl, man, you sure? Not really. Dude, anyways, let's go this way. Truth was, Winnie didn't want to retell Quan Lee's story. He felt intense loyalty and affection for the old man, so avoiding him seemed like the easiest way to honor his confession and prevent their 2 worlds from colliding. And by that, he meant being erased. The G train pulled up, brakes screeching. This sound so fucking toxic that passengers covered their ears. A few even left the platform rather, in protest. When the train doors opened, Winnie sat down and looked at Quan Lee through the window of the subway. There was no one listening to the old man's music as he played. No one was on the platform except a homeless woman sleeping on a heating vent and a group of Korean tourists pointing at the MTA map. But Quan Lee kept playing his music anyways, like some OG. And truthfully, Winnie fucking loved him for it. He loved the old man for not abandoning his craft. That was legit artist right there. Someone who fought for their art, even when they were the only person giving it the attention it deserved. Winnie had lived on the Bowery his whole life, didn't even know that New York was in America until he was 6. His parents spoke Cantonese and Taiwanese. Everyone in his fam did. The market signs on Grand Street where his mom bought groceries were written in simplified Chinese. His neighbors watched Cantonese soap operas in the afternoon. Old dudes hung out in Mr. Chang's corner store at night, playing dominoes and drinking ginseng tea and Viper whiskey, cracking jokes and woo. His super was Fujian too. Cheapest motherfucker he'd ever seen. Dude tried to fix everything with duct tape, tinfoil, and DAP. For the longest time, Winnie thought white people were the cultural tourists in his life. But in one day, Mama changed the rules of his storytelling forever. She'd taken him on the subway to Brooklyn over the Manhattan Bridge, giving him emotional distance from their apartment. As a kid, Winnie didn't realize New York was connected together by bridges, the vertebrae of the urban body. He didn't realize the subway lines were veins, the major lines, arteries, and the streets were capillaries. Until that fateful and transformative day, Winnie hadn't realized that he would always live in a fractal world in New York, that every borough was its own city of billboards, insects, and wandering spirits. Their subway ride to Brooklyn together confirmed what he'd always suspected, namely that New York was an ethnographic sponge, absorbing the screenplay of immigration. New York was a megapolis, its streets, highways, and bridges resembling the human nervous system. New York was an urban hive imploding with refugee stories, diasporic longing, bustling multiculturalism, and inherited wealth. New York was a collapsing urban space where the culture danced between neighborhoods and history intersected ethnicity, creating these abstract forms that interacted but never touched each other, like a kaleidoscope. Thank you. Okay, coming up next is Melissa Chadburn. Melissa, you got the mic.
Oh, I've unmuted myself. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. This is so much fun. I'm so glad to be here amongst all of you talented authors. I'm going to read from my debut novel, A Tiny Upward Shove. I'm just going to start from the beginning, so I don't need to set it up very much. I will say that this is maybe what I call like my trans-Pacific intersectional feminist intervention on the thriller. It does start with a dead body, but my narrator is the Aswang, who's a figure in Filipino folklore. So I'm gonna go ahead and just start from the beginning. Don't believe anyone who tells you that death comes quick and painless. That's bullshit. Dying hurts like fuck all everything. You can feel all the pains, the hurts, the joys, the cries of all the world. There's no numbing dope, no dick wows, no kitty kitty yum yum, just a floodlight on all the world's needs. Death is a dump. You see it all. Kids, parents, teachers, the rats under the street that run through the sewers, suck, suck, squeak, squeak. The pigeons that shit everywhere. The throwaways nobody else wants, the thugs, the queers, the hoes, the junkies, the brats, the fuck-ups, the killers. Let me get this straight. The way I'm telling you any of this, I'm Aswang. And I know about the slow agonies of death, because this body belonged to one of the throwaways, an 18-year-old girl named Marina who wound up murdered on a pig farm in a place called Port Coquitlam. Before I finished the tinikling, before I jumped into her body, before Marina found Wiley on the corner of Main and Hastings, before the track marks on the insides of her knees and elbows, she lived a cleaner life. Before the late night diner trips where she saw before falling into sleep her mother's face, a face took up with large, dark eyes reflecting the suspicion of others. She still hoped to be a pure spirit. Marina used to be 12. She used to live in a group home named For Trees, 5 in a cottage out in the valley. She had the bottom bunk and Alex on top, too close to the popcorn ceiling, plastered with CK1 ads torn out of fashion magazines. She used to look into people's dining rooms as she walked down the street. She put herself at one of those tables with roasted chicken and vegetables picked from a garden, not mashed potatoes poured flaky out of a box like her ma used to make, not carnation powdered milk mixed with water, though she did like to pick out the congealed lumps and feel them separate like pudding on her tongue. She used to do graffiti on government-issued desks, waiting for her name to be called. Marina used to stand around with teenage boys on the street corner waiting for the light to change. She used to hitch rides through the valley and give strange men handjobs for $20. Marina used to worry about gonorrhea and feel like she was the worst living piece of fuck shit. And before all that, Marina used to be 5. She used to lie on her tummy and a thumb plunked in her mouth, index finger curled around her nose, and sometimes Mucha would come in and rub her back and tell her a story of a time long, long before. Marina used to leave a small music box outside in the rain, hoping to attract fairies. She used to practice kissing girls on the back of her hand or her own shoulder, just to see what her skin tasted like. She used to get all squirmy and thrilled watching whodunits with her ma. She used to long for the ordinary. She used to live with just ma, and they might have been poor, but they had a good time. Their homemade games were sometimes Marina running out to the garage behind the apartment building and picking up the water hose. She'd learned how to spray the water so it swished up toward the sky and back down like her own private waterfall. Then she ran around the apartment shouting, "Bomb, bae, bee, bo, boo," a pillowcase, her white wings tied around her neck, her childlike chatter so candid and fresh. And right then she figured she was the luckiest girl alive. This man who strangled Marina was a puck shit trick who didn't know how to be a trick, always fell in love with the wrong girl, pure poco trash, drove around Vancouver in his van loaded with possibilities. To him, women like Marina were nothing but a reminder of all his failings. There in that room, leaning above her, his closed smile turned into a full-on cheese. There were his rotted teeth, his puffy gray gums, and for a split moment, for the final time in her throwaway life, she felt her mitihin, that exquisite pain of want, desire, but want is for the living. And by that dark, barely morning hour, Marina was nearly dead. As he throttled her, she felt her own muffled sounds push into the part of her that had been sleeping, cut off a long time ago. Her screams clung to that hollowed out part, to her guts, to the trailer walls, then zipped along the hot gas of the cosmos as the dark stone sky settled over the farm. The moment she was dying, Marina prayed. First, she prayed an invocation, something she'd heard her Lola say over and over again. Let light stream forth into the minds of men. Let love stream forth into the hearts of men. Let purpose guide the little wills of men. Let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. She thought of her Lola's cool hands on her burning forehead when she was stuck homesick. Mounted on the wall above them was the head of a golden horse. Marina stared deep into the dark nostrils of the horse. Her murderer straddled her on top of the bed, his hands clasped around her neck. The face he showed her, the face that was breathing hard, placed no more than a foot from her own, was stuck in a tight grin. The face of an oink oink baboy, the pigs he farmed, both of them drenched in the toxic defect of all the sorrow coursing from his hands to her neck, from her neck to his hands. The smudges of smoke on the walls, the dark corners of the ceiling, a wisp of spider's web in the corner of the nostril of the head of the horse. Her Lola's prayer wasn't working. Lola belonged to a generation of obedience and atonement. Marina's was a generation of don't give a fucks. So she made a special kind of prayer. Marina imagined hipon wrapped in taro leaves, stewed in chiles and coconut milk. She imagined a small loaf of sticky rice with mango, fly swatters, brown rubber discs used to open jars, large wooden utensils hanging from a kitchen wall, bamboo mats painted with anthuriums, the mats that she slept on in her Lola's ranch house in Seaside, California. She thought of Alex, the love of her life, and her perfect eyeliner, how it made her look elegant, like the flawless face of a calculating wife. This prayer didn't work either if working means saving her from death, but the prayer did work if working means turning her into me, into something powerful, into Aswang. The truth in the prayer summons the Aswang first by bringing up her ancestral bloodline, and then the key to tying me to her, unfinished business. Marina was murdered mid-quest. She chanted this mantra in her mind over and over, pulling me out of the ether and down into her body, merging with the powers that carry me across the time into generations of her family. The words spread out around her, invaded her ears, her mouth, until the sound of her screams became me. Thank you. Now I would love to introduce Tracey Lien.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. My name is Tracey Lien, and I'm the author of All That's Left Unsaid. The novel begins, the novel is set in the year 1996 in Cabramatta, which is a Vietnamese refugee enclave in Sydney, Australia. The story begins when a 17-year-old boy is beaten to death at a Cabramatta restaurant. When his older sister, Key, returns home for the funeral, she learns that the police are completely stumped by her brother's case. About a dozen witnesses were present the night he died, and they all claim to have seen nothing. So Key takes it upon herself to track down each witness to find out what happened. So I wrote this novel because I really wanted to challenge the myth of the model minority. So I've lived in America for nearly 10 years now, but I am originally from Australia. And growing up in Australia, I was told from a really young age that you're as Aussie as they come, that you belong, you'll get a fair go, and that Australia really values multiculturalism. But what I realized at some point was that this wasn't quite true and that it didn't apply to me or to people who looked like me. I realized that my citizenship was conditional. It was conditional on my impeccable behavior. It was conditional on my gratitude. And if I ever did anything to step out of line, then I risked being perceived as a nuisance or worse, as a threat. And we've seen a version of this play out in America recently, where Asian Americans, once thought of as the success stories of this country, were almost overnight viewed as threats to public health or carriers of the Kung flu. And to be on the receiving end of that kind of hate and fear, it's frustrating, it's confusing, it's hurtful. But one of the things that has gone left unsaid for a long time is that it's also dangerous. And that's what the title of my novel refers to. It's about the unspoken consequences of anti-Asian sentiment. But it's also about all these other things that are often left unsaid, like the responsibility that the children of immigrants feel that they have for their parents, how we withhold information to protect those we love. It's about how no community is a monolith. You know, we often hear of Asian Americans being spoken of as if they're these monolithic blocks, when the reality is we're just like everyone else. We're just as stubborn and smart and funny and goofy, and we're just as capable of failure. So my novel tackles a lot of these heavy issues, but it was important to me that it could also be a fun read. So I learned a lot and borrowed a lot of the conventions from murder mysteries. So as you're reading with each chapter, you're getting closer and closer to finding out the truth. So I'm going to read a very short snippet from the novel. It's from a chapter told from the point of view of the only white character. She is a high school teacher. She is a very well-intentioned white woman. And the reason I like this chapter is because I think it illustrates how even the most well-intentioned people can screw up, but also that how the most well-intentioned people can contribute to a problem and increase the tension in a place. So this is the beginning of chapter 5. When the first Indo-Chinese refugees arrived in Australia, Sharon Faulkner was a high schooler in Sydney's inner west who had seen Asian people only in photos, on the news, and in World War II textbooks that showed propaganda posters of the Japanese as buck-toothed rats. When the first Indo-Chinese refugees left the Commonwealth migrant hostels in Villawood, Fairymeadow, East Hills, and Dundas, equipped with a handful of English phrases, a distaste for porridge, and the newly acquired knowledge that they couldn't digest cow's milk, Sharon Faulkner was on her way to Newcastle, farther north, to study education with a cohort that was completely middle-class Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And when the first Indo-Chinese refugees settled in Cabramatta, opened the first pho restaurants, established the first Vietnamese grocery stores that sold packets of dehydrated noodles, bottles of pungent fish sauce, and tubs of nose-prickling spices, Sharon Faulkner accepted a job straight out of university at a high school in Hay, some 725 kilometers from Sydney, town population 1,300. Hay was a comfortable place for Sharon Faulkner to teach. In a place like Hay, teachers were on a first-name basis with parents, and the kids themselves weren't too different from her. They all burned easily in the sun, watched cricket on Boxing Day, and used the term mate in a passive-aggressive manner to signal that they'd run out of patience. Example, sit down and shut up, mate. But Sharon was a city girl at heart. She wasn't made for Hay's scorching summers or the vast ring of nothing that surrounded the town and stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions. The first time she saw a tumbleweed, she ran out of her cottage in pajamas and a pair of flip-flops to follow it, giddy to see where it would go, a neighbor's driveway. She'd never thought they were actually real. By the second, third, fourth, and fifth time they rolled by her house, her classroom window, or alongside her Toyota Corolla hatchback, as she drove down Hay's quiet roads, they reminded her only of how far she was from the tree-lined suburbs she so dearly missed, with the milk bars run by Greeks and Italians, the diversity of colorful neighborhoods where heads of rich brown hair dotted a sea of blondes, where olive-skinned blokes said yous when they meant to say you. Sharon spent 3 years in Hay. She took the first transfer available to a metropolitan school in a suburb with a name that she thought sounded Italian. When the first Indo-Chinese refugees, motherless and fatherless, found one another in southwest Sydney, banded together, created their chosen family, them against the world. When they enrolled in high school without understanding a word the teachers said. When the parents who came with babies and toddlers raised them the best they could, put them in secondhand school uniforms, ordered them to work hard, to be good, to claw back the success and stability that had been torn from them. When a 16-year-old black-haired boy smoked a white powder off a piece of aluminum foil, then passed it to his friend, who passed it to his friend, who passed it to his friend. when the police and politicians decided that a certain ethnic enclave didn't have the DNA to be Australian, and the Prime Minister of the country said Vietnamese sob stories didn't ring his withers, and the friction of fear and hate coalesced in an Italian-sounding suburb of 4 square kilometers. Sharon Faulkner, freshly transferred from Hay, hair bleached golden by the sun, arrived in Cabramatta. Thank you, and now I'll hand it over to Soon Wiley.
Thanks, Tracy. Quite a tough act to follow here with all these incredible writers. Thank you to Lily and Melanie, Center for Fiction, Asian American Writers Workshop for putting this together. This is just fantastic and really honored to be a part of it. I'm gonna read two short sections from my debut novel, When We Fell Apart. The novel is told from two different perspectives. The first perspective is comes from Min, who's the protagonist of the book. He's a young Korean American. He's also biracial. He's arrived in Seoul with kind of a vague sense of hoping to find himself. But when the novel opens, he's just been told that his girlfriend has died under mysterious circumstances. The police are kind of pushing the idea that it's suicide, but Min is kind of in disbelief. And so his portion of the novel follows his quest to try to uncover the truth behind that and whether it was suicide. And then in alternating chapters, we get Yujin's perspective, and her timeline's a little bit different. So when the novel opens, she's dead, and Min's kind of story progresses as his search for the truth. Yujin's sections open when she's actually in high school. So there's kind of this odd effect of, you're hearing her voice even though you know that she's gone. So I'll just read briefly from two sections. The first section is from Min, and this is kind of a flashback, and I think it'll give some context for some of the reasons why he's ended up in Seoul, and kind of looking for himself a little bit. For as long as he could remember, Min had harbored the sneaking suspicion that he didn't belong anywhere. In kindergarten, teachers puzzled aloud over his name during attendance. Min Jun Ford, what a lovely combination. What was it he had combined? Where did his mother start and his father end? Lance, a black boy from Culver City, was his only friend, and Min marveled over the darkness of his skin, the absoluteness of it, how he wished to have a canvas so definite, so clearly one thing. On a middle school camping trip, he'd refused to kiss a girl during a game of truth or dare, seeing the look of anxiety and fear in her eyes. Whether her trepidation was from the idea of a kiss with tongue or simply because it was him, he would never know. Even with some ribbing from his friends, he'd refused. He grew wary of girls, unable to believe they found anything attractive about him. His slender, almost feminine hands, his straight, boring hair, his eyes that tapered ever so slightly. He was not, as the high school girls said, hot or dreamy. Those terms were reserved for the few, the many. Things changed in college. Surrounded by 45,000 other students at UCLA, Min quickly found he was considered worthy of attention, even attractive by women. He started dating casually. He'd begun lifting weights, and soon his frame filled out. Gone was his round, boyish face. The bridge of his nose had grown prominent, his jaw square, like his father's, a white man's jaw. He played intramural sports, attended parties, aced his classes, all while straddling two lanes, distinctly aware that he had both white and Asian friends. The collision of these two worlds was something Min never had to worry about. Everyone stuck to their groups, their comfort zones, except for Min, who happily occupied the in-between for the entirety of his freshman and sophomore years. He saw no issue. It was his biology, after all. Then friend groups became more serious, couples formed, spring break vacations were planned, internships sought, and soon Min found himself stuck, forced to choose an identity, a single spyglass through which to gaze. While attending a party for young Asian entrepreneurs, he overheard a group of girls bemoaning his unavailability. He only went for blonde bimbos, as they called them. At the time, he was dating a girl from Orange County. Tiffany was blonde. Bimbo she was not. They'd met during an indoor soccer club game. Everything had been going well between them, except that he'd recently visited her during their winter break, which resulted in an awkward moment when her father thought he was the gardener's son. A year later, he was dating a girl from Tiburon who adored him for his not-so-Koreanness, as she called it. He was the perfect combination, Korean enough so she never had to explain herself, American, white enough that he didn't expect her to wait on him hand and foot like all the other Korean guys she dated. He had progressive ideas about gender roles. He was a feminist. Things had gone well until Min revealed he was agnostic. During their protracted breakup, Grace said her parents would never approve of a marriage to someone who didn't believe in Christ. It seemed there were limits to how much not-so-Koreanness Grace could tolerate. And I'll just read very quickly from Yujin's section. This is in the present of her story, and this is when she's kind of just arrived in Seoul, and she's from a more provincial, small city. And this is kind of her orientation before university. Seoul was everything. The city churned with a kind of technicolor effervescence, a civilization in orchestrated chaos. For the first time, I was a part of something bigger than myself. I was a microscopic organism, a molecule, a speck, a chip on a motherboard blinking away with all the other lights, burning up the grid. And I imagined that grid of lights witnessed from space, a yellow crossword puzzle glittering with brilliant expectation. I was where I was meant to be, living the life I was supposed to live. I began looking back on my time in Gaedong as a mistake, a mix-up in the sorting. Here, in Seoul, this was where I belonged. And it wasn't just the city itself. It was EY University, with its expansive quads framed by lush foliage, turning brilliant and oranges and reds, the entire student body buzzing with a sense of purpose. But it wasn't merely for the grades like in high school. These women seemed driven by something bigger, something more abstract, a quest for power and strength. And I was in the middle of it all with my roommate, Sora. Thanks. And I think I'm going to turn things over to Jackson.
Soon, that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think one question I've been thinking about as I was listening to all of you, and I'm hoping we can use as a launch point into, a short conversation is, what is it like, and I guess what was it like to write yourself into a world that didn't have books like this 20 years ago? I'm just interested to know the role you felt you were playing for yourself, for your community, or whatever, but I'm interested in that idea of, writing books, maybe that on some level we wish had existed when we were growing up, writing ourselves into a literary archive where these books weren't available, 20, 30 years ago. And how, if at all, did all of you sort of, grab that torch and say, let me in, and what role, if any, did you feel you were playing for yourself or for any community or people? And did you at any point write for yourself? Did you write this book on some level for yourself? So I guess there's like 12 questions there. Pick what you want.
I can try to answer that for myself. So I try to think of it in terms of what was I building upon, right? Like what had other people already written, what ideas and concepts were already out there, and how could I sort of stretch, a slight distance beyond that. And so I think a lot of what I had read when it came to sort of examinations of racial discrimination, especially against Asian American or Asian Australian characters, it was this idea that, well, the families hadn't assimilated, or, they were having trouble fitting in because of a language barrier, because they were undocumented, because of all these factors, right? But the idea was that maybe the next generation, things would be fine because they would belong. And the idea I wanted to build on was that, what if that's not true? What if you are born and raised in Australia or in America and you didn't need to assimilate because you were born fully formed like that. You were already an American citizen or an Australian citizen, and it still wasn't enough. And your citizenship was still conditional. And so when thinking of where this story fits in I guess the timeline of literature, whatever you want to call it, I was like, okay, this is like the next step, acknowledging that, you know, assimilating wasn't enough, that there is something much more insidious happening that we really need to confront. And I think as a society, we've started to a little bit, especially like the pandemic kind of forced it. But yeah, I think that was what I was attempting to do. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
That's great. Other people?
I love this question so much. I mean, I have never read this book. I've never read a queer Black Latina girl who grew up in LA County's foster care system, you know? And I think at one point people were like, are you afraid that you're gonna like be pigeonholed? And I'm like, I don't think that there's like an echo chamber of these narratives, you know? And so in many ways, I did write this book for myself because it's one that I want to read. But also I have so much gratitude for all the people who have come before me. I mean, this book couldn't have been written 20 years ago. And even now in this day and age, like I have gotten so many people requesting like a glossary in the back, like the way we address translation is so different now. And even dialogue, you know, whether or not the punctuation is different. And I am so grateful for that because things are able to reflect more of my thinking process. And I also don't have to subscribe to, like, I can write fractally, like I don't have to subscribe to the hero's journey, or like, I don't have to just subscribe to that sort of like traditional, you know, plot structure. And so all of that has made way for me to think about that. And I have been lucky enough. I also probably couldn't have written this book before all the people who had come before me. You know, I've been able to study with people who have talked about the concept of post-memory or re-memory and how trauma works in narrative. So I'm just, yeah, I think that's such a neat question, and a neat thing to think about is that it is a narrative that probably couldn't have been told 20 years ago. And even now, I'm like, there are whole books written in Elfish, and y'all want me to like translate some Tagalog slang for you? Yeah, thank you so much.
I could go next. Jackson, that's a wonderful question. And I've been thinking this lately in the last year or so after the book has come out. Who did I write this book for? And who was I writing for while I was writing it? Because the book actually took 10 years, more than 10 years, 11 years. So when we talk about what was there 20 years ago, I feel like in those 10 years while I was writing the book, so many others, I would assume like the wonderful company that we have today, were also writing these other wonderful books, and they were not there 10 years ago, but they started coming out as I was writing them. And that I think was very heartening to read them, to be with these other kinds of books, just to see what they are doing and how they are also tackling these issues. One thing that I also felt I wanted to do, apart from writing the book for me, was not just about the book or whether there's a book like this, but I think it was important for me writing this to actually write not just the book, but write myself in a way, or into America. In my book, there's this scene where Seema stands behind President Obama in one of the scenes where he's during his election. And that, I think, felt for me like such an important thing to do, just to say that we are here and we want to be seen and we are part of this country, even if we are doing a lot of the work in the shadows, and we want to be out there. And so I think for me, that part was not just, is the book visible, but can we put ourselves on the stage? And therefore, in 2020, when Kamala Harris was going to be the vice president, it felt like a moment of coming around. Like we are finally here, we are on stage, and we are not somewhere hidden, and it felt like a moment of homecoming.
Jackson, I don't know if I can answer your question as articulated as everyone else. I mean, I think one of the things I think I've been thinking about, and Jackson, I'd actually be interested in know what your thoughts are on this as well, that authors of color often have to carry the burden of writing about identity, right? But in truth, like all novels are about identity, right? But it's just if you're a white author writing about identity, your books are not discussed in terms of identity, right? They're discussed in terms of literary merit or the American dream or some other kind of larger point. So for me, it was important to think about identity and Asian identity and bicultural, biracial, all this stuff. But it was also important for me to think about, when I was writing it, I am just writing Great Expectations. I am just writing The Great Gatsby is about identity, right? It just happens to be about white identity. So I think for me, that was one of the struggles, was to how do I like elevate that stuff, right? Asian American identity, how do I elevate these things that I care about, while also giving myself the, I don't know, the go ahead, right? To write a classic novel, whatever that might be. Because just as a biracial writer, it just, it feels weird to try to ascribe to any kind of one specific thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. I think I asked this question partially because I just remember going to bookstores as like a teenage mixed race Asian boy, and there was nothing for me, like nothing at all, There were no mixed race narratives. There would be 2 books by Asian Americans, and then even as a college student, you would take a, introduction to American literature course, and there would be a single Asian American author for years, for decades. And that void felt flagrant and isolating and deeply alienating. So I think a lot now in terms of what it means to not just create a work that connects to your community, et cetera, and not just to show love and respect to the discourse of which your book is part of, which is so important, but also what is it like to give a book that a girl who's 12 years old can read and be like, this is my story. I understand this story. Like, what is that like? Because most of us didn't have that, right? And the books we write create that opportunity for someone else to be like, wow, I thought I was the only person, who had this unique experience. Wow, I didn't know that, people like us get to tell our own stories, right? And to not be commodified by literary capitalism, for example. Those are huge, potentially political things, to consider, even though it's very personal. So I think that's just some of the thoughts I was having as I was, wrestling with that question.
To add to what you were saying, Jackson, about going into a bookstore and not really finding anything that was reflective of your experience. When I first started writing short stories, all my characters were white, and I didn't think anything of it. It never occurred to me that any of my characters could be not white. And it wasn't until I started reading the works of like Viet Thanh Nguyen and Leila Lalami, and just discovering all these authors who had written such powerful fiction where their characters were nuanced and interesting and varied, that I was like, oh, this is what we're allowed to do. And that was revelatory for me. But growing up in Australia, again, there was a lot of Jane Austen, there was a lot of Shakespeare, and there wasn't a lot of Asian Australian authors or characters at the time.
So yeah. I remember reading I Hotel, right, by Karen Yamashita, and reading Jessica Hagedorn's Dog Eaters, and just being like, we can tell stories this way. So not only do we get to tell our stories, but we get to tell our stories in our own way. This might be obvious within the academic community, but it's completely counterintuitive for a lot of non-white writers. I feel like it gives us permission to come up with our own narrative modality. And I feel like that's an amazing way to not just defy the expectations of the, you know, the stylistics of the empire, as Lisa Lowe calls it, right? But also to set those rules. So it's just, I don't know, this reading today seems like a perfect exemplification of the different ways we can tell stories, you know, and they don't have to agree and they don't have to all, you know, follow the same rules. Anyways. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a question following all the readings, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, even Jackson has this in your book. Going back to this question we have of writing about identities, I noted that all our books do have death. Even mine, though I didn't read a section, starts off with the death of Seema in the first page, and Jackson, you have, I think, the death of a father, and the other books also center death so prominently in each of them. So where is this coming from? I mean, are we, to go back to that question, are we putting our trauma out in some way, or is this something else, or is it just a novelistic desire? Is it a genre desire? I think Tracey spoke about murder mystery genre, and I love that genre. I read a lot of that myself, and I think I use that in my book too. Just wondering how that pictures into our work or into these works.
Well, I'll chime in. Like you, Nawaaz, I worked on this book for quite a long time. I mean, I was in edits for like 7 years, and I struggled a lot with structure. That was like the hardest part for me. I remember at one point my editor said, "You're like a bodybuilder with no skeleton." I was like, oh God. But I think so. The Novena just offered like a clear structure for me. I had 9 days for this Aswang to accomplish this thing. So I think that was one big motivation for having a death, because of the death rituals. You know, it offered some sort of structure to the text. But also, you know, I also like to think that it does start with a death, but it also starts with a birth, because it starts with a birth of the Aswang, which is a great response to that trope of like the body, you know. And the trope of the thriller is like usually a white woman, you know, it starts with a white woman's body. So I think that was what sort of my reaction to that. But thanks for that question.
I can try to answer as well. I decided to open with a death for a few reasons. One is that it just upped the stakes. And it was like a good way to sort of create that mystery. But I also think that when you depict how people grieve or mourn or process death, it can reveal a lot about a character or about their family. And so just sort of throwing that in there and allowing all my characters to react was a really effective way for me to sort of explore their desires, their fears, their guilt. And so it was just like an effective tool as well.
Similar to Tracey, I think mine was process a little bit, and you know, if left to my own devices, my characters are often fairly passive and hyper observant and end up doing nothing for pages upon pages. So I had to give my protagonist a body and something to do and a mystery to solve. And so for me, it was a purely kind of selfish, craft-based, kind of early stages drafting thing of I need to give my protagonist this kind of insurmountable quest, so that he can't wander aimlessly for pages upon pages, which would undoubtedly be completely unpublishable.
Yeah, Nawaaz, to your question, it's interesting because I hadn't observed that, but it makes me also think about the role that like ghosts and ghosting plays in Asian American culture and Asian American writing. I was doing a podcast with Chiwan Choi. Are you there, Ghost? It's me, Chiwan. And one of the questions he asked me was, who's being ghosted in your book, Jackson? And it made me think a lot. So going back to your question, it's hard not to connect the role that ancestral ghosting can play consciously and unconsciously, right, in Asian and Asian American narratives, because the ghosts tell us so much about the world that we can't repress, even if we try to, right? But it also seems like it's in the Asian American community, it's really connected to a lot of other things that are often trauma-based, like whether it's having ancestors who were, victims of colonization, right? Or the ghosts that shouldn't ever be forgotten, that connect us to the homeland or the motherland. I think ghosting is a really crucial sort of like literary technique in Asian American writing, and I think it should be, right? And so even though I had noticed that the way you had, Nawaaz, I think it's a great question, and I think it helps kind of show some of the unique ways in which Asian American storytelling, right, can be richer and deeper and have a connection to politics and history and identity.
So, hi everyone. We're just about at the hour. What an amazing array of literature we were able to hear tonight. Such great storytelling. Thank you all for bringing your talents to us. That was Ahmed, Jackson Bliss, Melissa Chadburn, Tracey Lien, and soon Wiley. And Lily, you want to pop back on camera too? Lily, thank you so much for everything that you did to help put this together. Please check out more events that the Asian American Writers Workshop are putting together. And we've got some other collaborations coming up this coming fall. So check out what Center for Fiction has too. Please support these amazing writers. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope to see you all again in person in real life someday soon. So thanks everybody.